Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence independent media production. If you're new and just joining us, we do this every Tuesday tutorial videos. We are less of a playing channel, more of an educational channel, and really just getting into sounds and techniques for getting the sounds you're trying to get out of your drum. Today we are talking about seating drum heads. What does it mean? Should you do it? Should you maybe definitely not do it? Let's find out. Seating drum heads. This is apparently a pretty controversial topic, I'm finding out, and it means a lot to some people. I've noticed that some people take it really seriously. They think it's a really integral part of installing new drum heads on the drum set, and even part of just tuning, going in between tunings. So we just want to talk about what it is, when it makes sense to do, and what some of the variables are, basically, to make sure that you're also not damaging your heads in the process. Thanks, as always, to our presenting sponsor, ProMark by D'Addario, for helping us out here. Today, we are going to be working with my Noble & Cooley snare drum, which if you're a frequent viewer, you've seen before. It needed new heads anyway, so this is the candidate today. And we're going to basically just go through what it means to seat a drum head and what the merits and pitfalls are of doing this. The batter today is my preferred snare batter, which is the Evans G12. It's a 12 mil coated head, single ply. And what we're going to talk about here is what to do, basically, if you're putting it on, it's brand new, and what seating can do for you. So seating, as I understand it, has to do with applying pressure to a drum head with the hoop on. Some people do it with the hoop off. It has to do with conforming the head to the bearing edge and getting it to touch everywhere. Some people also talk about the cracking of the glue around the flesh hoop, different sounds they hear when they do it, and ultimately the goal is to get the head to conform to that specific drum for easy tuning, wide tuning range, getting a good sound quickly, all of that stuff that we love. I really don't do this in the sense that it's been described to me like a lot of pressure or as if it's necessary for getting the drum tuned up and sounding good. This can also be affected by what brand of heads you use, what brand of drum you use, the way that the edges are constructed, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, there are times, especially if you've watched any snare tuning videos here, where I do put pressure on the head, but it's a very small amount of pressure. So what we're going to do is we're going to install this head, and we're going to find out what it kind of does to utilize this method to try to get it to fit to the drum as best as possible. Before we get into this, let's run through a couple of steps to find out if this is even a thing that's really going to change your life very much. This head here, normal drum head. This drum, fairly normal drum. But we do need to take into account that this drum has a pretty sharp 45-degree inner cut, not much of an outer cut. It's not undersized like some drum companies have done to try to get around this issue. It's pretty much as standard as you can get. Now, we take this drum head and we lay it right on the edge. Now we want to find out if this head is laying flat on the drum. The easiest way to do that is to leave the hoop off and just go around the drum and press in a few spots just inside of the bearing edge. Not super hard, but to see if the head is tilting back and forth on the drum. This head's laying flat. It's not canting back and forth. Depending on the specific head that you have with you or the brand you're using or the drum you have, these are all variables that can change. So if it is kind of kicking back and forth and not just laying flush on top of the drum, there may need to be a little bit of pressure applied during the tuning process to make sure that you get it level onto the bearing edge. Now, thing number two, how much play is there with the head when you move it around on top of the drum? How much wiggle room is there laterally? So this head on this drum only has maybe like a millimeter or two of play back and forth. It's very, very little, which means that there's a very low likelihood that we're going to get a head tensioned up at kind of a crooked angle or off center of the drum. If you're using drums that have been intentionally undersized to try to sit with the heads better, you do have to pay extra attention that the head is centered when you're tensioning it up. And that's just something you can watch with your eyes, and you can also kind of see sometimes. Some vintage drums have this issue too, or if you happen to have metric sizes, these things you might run into. Now, in a perfect world, all drum heads would sit this way on a drum. They would be level. They would just sit flush. The collar would be touching the bearing edge all the way around. And most importantly, the edge of the drum would be contacting the head on the flat of the head and not somewhere along the curve of the collar. That's where we run into issues with dead spots, and we run into issues with it being off-center and having strange overtones that seemingly won't tune out. Sometimes you end up with a situation where one of your lugs is just cranked down because of the way the head was manufactured, and then the hoop's not level. There's all kinds of just crazy things that can happen. It's also recently been brought to my attention that there is a phenomenon referred to as crushing the collar, which apparently involves taking a head. I'm going to do it on the head that was on this drum rather than this fresh one, but taking a head before you put it on the drum and manually crushing or massaging the collar of a brand new head to try to make it more pliable before you put it on the drum. I never heard of this until just now. I've never done it. I can't speak to the positive effects of it. I can imagine some negative effects that could occur from doing this to a fresh head, because they are designed to not have this done to them and to sound good when you didn't do this. So, it's hard to say. And, as usual, if you have experience with this, we are wide open around here, of course. But needless to say, that feels pretty invasive on a drum head, and yeah, that's new to me. By the way, if you're interested in additional content or helping to support the channel, please go down into the description below this video and join our Patreon, where you can find all kinds of extras, interesting things, bloopers, all that fun stuff. All right, we're here. We're finger tight, heads on evenly. I haven't put a drum key to the batter head yet. And just as a quick and pretty crystal clear demonstration that this is touching everywhere, we have a clear tone coming out of the drum right now with just finger tight around. Now, a head that's not touching evenly on the bearing edge everywhere, or that's getting caught in the collar instead of on the flat of the head, is not going to do this. So now's the stage where a person might decide, I need to seat this drum head. And what seems to be the most common maneuver is to just press pretty firmly a few times in the center of the head. Now, if you are trying to get the collar to conform because you're kind of in the collar with the bearing edges, this can be a useful tool under certain circumstances, but you do need to know the risks. And the primary risk is if you have small points of pressure, you're going to put basically dents in the head that you may not be able to see that are going to disrupt the clarity of the pitch that you get when you tune it. The second thing that can happen is you can press this thing down crooked, like we were just talking about, because already it's not touching everywhere. So you're trying to get it to touch, but if you're off center, you're going to do that conforming to the collar, but not evenly, and then you're going to try to tune it after that and run into different problems. Another thing to watch out for that's less of a snare issue, but could be a toms issue, maybe a bass drum issue, is that a lot of pressure and a lot of stretching on a head, especially one that doesn't necessarily need this because of the construction, but really any head, is that you're going to be kind of diminishing your low end response, because much like an old drum head that's been played a ton and stretched out by a stick, the clarity and the warmth of the low end is the thing that's going to leave first, because more tension, at a higher tuning, is going to have a little more life in it over the course of the head. But when you're thinking about like a really low tune 16, like we were doing a couple of weeks ago, those sorts of things, you can crack that low end out of the head with your hands, or as I've heard, standing on it and even like putting, a ton of weight on it, which is also awfully focused weight in certain spots on the head and not even pressure everywhere. So, there's just a lot to watch out for with this to make sure that you don't end up just, kind of ruining the head, or at least damaging it in a way that's going to shorten the life. Now, imagining that I was in a situation where I felt like this head needed to be seated in this manner, the sort of like CPR method, we would be putting our hands in the center of the head like this, or, hopefully not fully CPR style, because then you're up on your knuckles, but pressing on the head super hard, well, medium hard to super hard, depending on who you talk to, and attempting to get this head to change its shape around the edge and turn into the shape of the bearing edge of the drum. Now, I don't need to do it with this head. It's also a 12 mil head. It's fairly thick. it's going to conform because we are on the flat part of the head with the edges of the drum. But you can imagine, leaning on it pretty aggressively this kind of way. Now, at this tension, it's not going to change the sound very much because there really isn't any tension on it. It's just finger tight. Where I do use some kind of pressure on the head is when I'm actually tuning the head up or down, and it's a much smaller amount of pressure than this. It's not about cracking anything. It's not about changing the shape of the head. It's actually about alleviating friction between the drum head and the bearing edge of the drum. I've even heard of people using paraffin wax and other things on the edges of the drums to try to help with this. I don't really do that, but the point is still there, which is similar to a guitar string or anything else that you're tuning. There is friction involved, and if you just tune and then play, that friction is going to relax over the course of playing, and the drum is going to then sound out of tune, whereas if you'd pressed on it and tuned it again, you wouldn't have that friction anymore. Another thing that people do, I think a fair amount of people actually do, and this is actually something that I have done more with like calf heads and things like that, but it does track with plastic heads, is the idea of over-tuning the drum past where you would normally use it and leaving it for a little bit to do this conforming process slower. This, to me, is a much more viable method of the end game that we're looking for here, because you're getting a slower impression. The hoop is doing the impression for you rather than your hands. And if you have the time to spare, it's as simple as just like changing your heads at night and then going and playing them the next day, like do it at the end of practice or at the end of the gig or something like that. This, to me, is a more practical method for what we're looking for here. That's about everything there is to say about this particular kind of issue with drums. And I think, if you're doing something like this and it works for you, that's totally groovy. I'm not telling anybody not to do these things. I'm just hoping to help people who don't know what this is, or people who are considering it, just understand the possibilities and also like the frustrations that you might run into. And next week, we're actually going to basically start where we are now at finger tight and demonstrate a tuning method that kind of goes along with this in a way of just making sure that you're really getting an even lay of the head on the drum. So that's all for today. So please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that notification button so you find out about our new videos. Please let us know what your experiences are with cracking drum heads, if it's really an intrinsic part of the way that you deal with your instrument, or if it's something that you've never ever heard of. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor, ProMark by D'Addario. And see you out there.